And Miguel Delaney of the London Independent joins us from Paris, waiting in Garden Nord. Miguel, it looks very modern and kind of almost boutique hotel behind you there.
I'm right at the back in their kind of like waiting area where people do work on their laptop. It's actually quite quiet today. I've been here when it's absolutely rammed and you can't move. There's only a few Liverpool fans. That's understandable though, because obviously that'll be the trip to London and then on through Avanti back up to Liverpool. And I have to say, one thing about doing these trips is getting to Paris from London to the Eurostar is a lot easier than doing the Liverpool trip.
Yes, I bet. Well, look, the locals have been silenced. They're shell shocked. Absolute
Yeah,
shock, confusion. They don't know how to feel about last night. They were so good, PSG, and obviously now the tie is very much in Liverpool's favour. So tell us about the game. Tell us about last night, the atmosphere, the whole thing.
Like it's an interesting one in terms of the atmosphere. Like I've done Paris Saint-Germain a lot over the years, but through kind of this Qatari ownership, and it's almost like it's been a weird thing with the club where the kind of I suppose what the club is in terms of the ownership, what they're trying to do, has always stood as a contrast to kind of what's quite a boisterous and traditional fan base that has actually been had its own kind of or tensions within between different parts of the fan base. But there's always been a raucous atmosphere, and it has felt for the first time, and I think this is linked to the fact that it's also the first time that the team actually fits a manager, that the team also fits the kind of the fan base, where there's an intensity to them. And yeah, for 35 minutes last night, I'd say they were brilliant. They look like the future of European football in some ways. It could easily have been 4-5-0 had it not been for Alisson. I don't think that's an exaggeration, given the chances, given the disallowed goal, given the potential red card for Kanate, given Alisson's performance. But then, as good as they were, I think after 35 minutes, there was a definite shift. Slot, as he spoke to us about afterwards, did change something. And Liverpool, even though they never had the control they do in recent Premier League games, they were much more comfortable, I think, for about 10 minutes before half time than they were in that really kind of tense opening spell.
Yeah. What did he say he changed, or what did he do?
So he said he was very actually direct about it. He said he changed his pressing. And so we spoke to Van Dijk after the game as well. And he basically said that initially they started the game expecting because of PSG's intensity, expecting to go man for man, and the Liverpool would just try and kind of loft balls over the top and play on the second man, but they couldn't do that. So Slot said they adjusted that. Also, I think it was very noticeable how, and it's funny, I was talking to some Liverpool staff about this, who felt even in the first half, Paris Saint-Germain basically felt they had the beating of Liverpool's two fullbacks. And not just the beating of them, but their wingers and their fullbacks at the beating of them. So obviously these massive stretches of space in behind Alexander-Arnold and Robertson, especially for Dembele to run into. And also one of the most striking things about the first half was the amount of space between McAllister and Szoboszlai. It was like one of those games in the 1990s when an English club would go to Italy and suddenly like they'd just be, or Spain, and they'd be opened up in the centre. But Slot, to be fair, he responded to that. I think even before half time, there was suddenly Liverpool had they'd withdrawn, they'd restricted that space, and PSG didn't really get at them in the same way. And I think this is pretty key to the game, because obviously this is a new PSG era. It's a much more interesting project than anything that's come before, even within the kind of the questions and debates about what the point of all this is through the Qatari ownership. But it's also very young. And I think that youth actually had a real influence in the game, because it was like they didn't have the experience to weather the fact they hadn't scored after 35 minutes. So I think that got to them, and they started to rush everything. And they didn't play in the same way. They needed that first goal.
I saw you saying in your piece that there is a feeling in the club from those that you've spoken to that they might be a year early here, Champions League terms.
Yeah, I mean, like even a year, given the youth to decide might be pushing it a bit, because suddenly they've got a lot of local Parisian teenagers who play the team. Now, Zaire Emery didn't start last night. It's still a young team, and I suppose because they're the sort of things, like in terms of being a year too early, in terms of developing as a team, games like that where it's the top level of European football and you have to weather missing chances and things like going your way. That's what you develop over that year, and it can take a while. Pretty quicker these days than it used to be in the 90s. Remember, like in terms of kind of what still remains almost a touchstone for European football in the Premier League, which is Ferguson's and United's kind of long nights to the soul in Europe. That still happens. It probably happens shorter, but yeah, I think that's exactly it in terms of that. It's a year too soon for them, because really, I mean, if psychology and kind of that sort of mentality dictated the game And to be fair, Luis Enrique was very strident about how it was Alisson that actually dictated the way the game went. The first half hour, though, it did feel a little bit like we were looking at like football from the future, or at least football of the type that can only be played by youthful players who represent players on the way up.
Yeah. Liverpool do have an adaptability. They are a rounded team. Man City, and there weren't many foibles with them at their best, but obviously when they weren't imposing their will on a game, they weren't as adept at kind of, okay, we just need to retreat and protect ourselves. Whereas Liverpool will do that in Premier League games when they aren't going especially well. But you're right about that first, 35 minutes, even on 36 minutes, Kvaratskhelia dribbled past 3 Liverpool players in the box and a brilliant shot near post. It's a great one-handed save from Alisson. So, it was a full-on assault for the guts of 35, 40 minutes. But out wide, there was a moment where Dembele was given the ball on the touchline and Robertson goes diving in. I think there's kind of an anxiety on Robertson's part. He knows this is not a good situation. There's 20 yards of space behind me.
Yeah.
And Dembele with kind of like calm and ease knocks it by him and ultimately sets up a really good chance for Neves. Those wide players for PSG, Barcola and Dembele, and Kvaratskhelia is an amazing player as well. That front three... geez, they had their way with Liverpool. I think Slot's only option was to everybody into our shell.
Yeah, and there's 2 things there. First of all, I think you're absolutely right. As brilliant as City have been for 8 years, what was the most defining trend of these types of Champions League games they played under Guardiola? Well, it was when things weren't going their way. They did suffer some collapses. And suddenly they concede 2 and 3 in quick succession. And even City at their best, you could have seen that happening last night. So I think there's definitely more adaptability. Slot has a much more of a pragmatism about him, even within that kind of Guardiola approach. And secondly, I suppose, just in terms of the intensity with PSG played at. It's about all season we've been talking about a revitalised Liverpool, how we've made so much with this squad that had been rebuilt just before Klopp went. And yet, PSG made them look pedestrian. Suddenly you're thinking I wrote this in the piece as well, but you can now see why a lot of the word was last summer that Slot basically wanted to change the entire forward line outside Salah, and even Salah in the medium term. We know kind of what the future is there, but this is why, because this was what PSG had represented something different, something distinctive. And actually, speaking of distinctive, I think it's rare you can say this in kind of the truest sense of the term, but Kvaratskhelia must be an actually unique player in European football. He's like something out of the 1980s, but with a kind of a 2025 physique, because he can obviously he's so languid, and he has such a turn of pace. It's remarkable. And it's funny there as well, because I did a piece. The last time I watched them live was for Georgia when they beat Portugal to get through the Euro 2024 group. And Willy Sagnol spoke after the game, and he was talking about how Georgian football actually made a point of actually trying to develop properly individualistic players to kind of utilize that talent. And I suppose he's the ultimate product of that. He's a remarkable player.
Oh, that's really interesting. A bit more of that, please. I think the Georgians might be onto something there.
And I suppose there is, I think there's probably something to do with the fact that kind of geographical remoteness. Also, there is, I remember when I used to work for the Sunday Independent, and Ireland played Georgia in 2016, I did a piece on the history of Georgian football that way, and kind of with their kind of defining moment was what was almost the Georgian national team at the time, which is Dynamo Tbilisi, because obviously all the kind of separate states were subsumed under the USSR in terms of international representation. So Dynamo Tbilisi almost became their kind of de facto national team. It was full of the best Georgian players. And if you watch when they played Liverpool in the early 80s, they absolutely destroyed them in a way that Liverpool weren't used to. But it wasn't just they destroyed them. You can go and watch the goals on YouTube. They were so distinctive in terms of what their willingness to do. Centre half suddenly surging 80 yards forward to slip a ball through for the forward to kind of try a really inventive finish. So there was obviously this culture there. And what Sanyal was speaking about in the summer was that Georgian football basically, it had, obviously it's tried to follow the wider game in terms of kind of ensuring it has a proper academy system, but actually striking out on its own a bit, because you can look at the evolution of European football, and there's obviously the Dutch created a certain style, Spain took that on and really put their own spin on it. Spain influenced Germany. Germany and Spain have influenced England and right up to Italy now. And like it's quite similar. Whereas Georgia look like, and with Kvaratskhelia personifying this, look like they're doing something actually quite different. And to be fair, what they did in the summer was very much overperform.
Yeah. Well, he's a joy. So I asked this next question, and at the same time, if you put a gun to my head, I would say Liverpool are probably going to go through here against PSG and are give or take, favourites for the Champions League with Real Madrid and whoever else you want to throw into the equation. However, and I sort of mentioned this to Jonathan Wilson on Monday, it was striking the way Luis Enrique was talking about Liverpool pre-game, and like. The context there is he's an opposing manager. He's buttering up the opposition. So there's maybe a little bit of salt in what he's saying. But he was kind of like, well, Liverpool are the best team in Europe by a mile. They're the best form team. They play the best football. They are the best team. And it's not that I necessarily I don't rate them. But at the same time, they are just 3 points better off in a lesser league than they were this time last year. And they are winning a league where Man City have completely abdicated, where Arsenal have been ravaged a touch and are just, they're 10 points worse off than last season. This is a league where Nottingham Forest are third. Yeah. And so, Liverpool are going along very nicely. But, who in the Premier League have they really had to beat that's been a great team? They drew 2-2 away at Arsenal. They came back twice, and that was good. And, they'll beat Chelsea and they'll beat Man City and they'll do that kind of thing. But I'm just wondering... It's a little premature to have this Liverpool are a great side kind of coronation. And Luis Enrique, I thought, was when he said that, I thought, is everyone across Europe looking at this team in awe and thinking, wow, that Liverpool 2024-25 team, that is the best team in Europe. I don't see them that way yet. And I think there's a good chance they win the Champions League and the league when I ask the question. But how good is our Liverpool at the moment?
I think very good. I think you're right in that. I suppose this the thing with all these sort of debates, it's always difficult in actually discussing who's the greatest of all time. Because in some ways, and that's a separate discussion, as you said, but a sense of kind of, you're always subject to the kind of season. And there are teams that have won a lot. And there's some great Real Madrid sides who say weren't as good as the team that finished second to Barcelona through the Pep Guardiola era. Similar. Yeah. I still think when you take them at their absolute best, the team say that Jurgen Klopp had in 2019, finished second to City and won the Champions League, was better than this Liverpool team. But then it's all about the context and, rise and fall of different squads. I think, look, on any terms, Liverpool are obviously a very good team. Liverpool at this point in their history, if they have, is there any way well set up, they're going to be one of the best teams in Europe because this is the kind of the economy of the game now. Slot has done an excellent job. But I think there's an interesting thing, and you mentioned it there in reference to Arsenal. The story of this season is almost one of, and I know this is a very kind of American sport thing. There's a famous quote about it that I can't remember who said at the time, but Liverpool have basically been able to keep their best players on the pitch in a way almost no one else has. And that will end up actually, I think, one of the real stories of this season. As brilliant as Slot is, one of the reasons they did appoint Slot was because of his willingness to buy into the system, because of how advanced he is in terms of this physical approach. He's very performance-led in the way other ideologue coaches aren't necessarily.
Yeah.
And what that has resulted in is that everyone from Real Madrid to City to Arsenal, well, they've all had major injury issues, and this has obviously been massive in the Premier League. Liverpool have, look how often Salah and Van Dijk have played.
Yeah. No, it's an absolutely fair point. Who do you make favourites for Champions League then when all is said and done?
I would still say Liverpool, but I was going to say to you there as well, actually, there's one thing being the best team in Europe up until March. The actual key is Real Madrid, no better than anyone, is to be the best team in Europe March to May.
Yeah.
So that's where this can get, and I think there's going to be a massive factor here. Well, one is going to be what this calendar does in terms of injuries and how this distorts the season. But two is also what that side of the draw is going to do. Because I think basically, maybe Barcelona, I'm still not that convinced by Bayern. All of the best sides are on this side of the draw.
Yeah.
So you got the three Premier League teams. Okay, maybe Villa aren't at that level, but they're a good side in their Premier League. The two Madrid sides and Paris Saint-Germain. And I think the games between each other, I mean, it's something they say a lot in European football now, but those the final stages are often like a 12th round of boxing. That they're really difficult to teams are really throwing what they've got left, and that could actually be very decisive come the season's end.
Yeah, brilliant. Listen, I know you have to run and catch a train. Enjoy your croissant and your coffee and your copy of L'Equipe, and have a nice time.
My Paul baguette.
See you, Miguel. Thank you. Yeah.